Hello everyone, RJM3 here. I have something special in store for you all today. My first ever collaboration.
I've been working with another small alternate history YouTube channel, Knights of the Alternate History, to create a two-part series detailing an alternate history where the Fenian Raid succeeded. For those of you who don't know, the Fenian Raids were attempted invasions of Canada carried out by the Fenian Brotherhood in the aftermath of the American Civil War. The Fenian Brotherhood was an Irish Republican organization based in the United States of America. The intended goal of the raids was to hold Canada hostage to force the British to give independence to Ireland. Of course, in our timeline, they failed miserably. But in mid-July of this year, Simon from Knights of the Alternate Histories approached me to work on a timeline in which the 1817 Fenian Raid succeeded.
We agreed that he would make part 1 and I'd make part 2. Part 1 is already up on his channel, linked in the description, and I recommend you watch that video first before watching this one. As for you newcomers here from Simon's channel, I wish you all a warm welcome. You're gonna love it here. Oh, and just to be clear, this video is not part of my What If series. Season 1 is over, and Season 2 isn't until later this month. This collaborative project is its own separate thing. Anyway, enough with the introduction. Let's get right into What If the Fenian Raid Succeeded, Part 2.
The year is 1918. It has been nearly 50 years since the Fenian Brotherhood took over Canada, and history has changed greatly because of it. 2 years ago, Britain joined the Great War to assist the Russian Empire to combat the growing power of the Central Powers, including Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, and France. When the British first landed troops in Calais and Dunkirk, they thought it would be as simple as marching to Paris and then to Berlin, and then the war would be over. They couldn't have been more wrong. The British barely advanced 20 miles into northern France before their attack was completely halted by the French and the Germans, with the fighting devolving into trench warfare. Combined with British supply lines being harassed by the German and French navies, and aid being supplied to the Central Powers by the United States and Fenian Canada, the British were forced to pull out of France after only 4 months. Without a major breakthrough made on the Western Front, Russian morale finally broke. Russian Tsar Nicholas II is overthrown. With the Germans having advanced far too deep into Russia, the Russian Provisional Government led by Alexander Kerensky surrendered to the Central Powers. The British invasion was so disastrous, it emboldened the Italians into joining the war and attack Britain's colonies in Africa. Britain now stood alone against all of Europe, its only allies being its longtime ally Portugal and the opportunistic Empire of Japan, which was more than happy to seize all of Germany and France's colonies in East Asia, though it did little to turn the tide in Europe. Now in Berlin, a telegram has arrived from across the English Channel. After reading the telegram, the German High Command applauds in celebration. The United Kingdom of Great Britain has requested an armistice. Weeks later in London, an English veteran enters a bar, sits down, dropping his newspaper on the counter. In bold letters, the headline reads, "Armistice is signed, Britain surrenders." At that moment, the man takes a vow to himself and to all of Britain and her remaining colonies that he himself will avenge the disaster that was the Great War and restore the British Empire to its former glory. The man's name? Oswald Mosley. The Treaty of Vienna, the treaty that ends this alternate Great War, is signed on June 28, 1919. The treaty divided up the Balkans amongst the Austrians and the Bulgarians. Russia had to give up Poland, the Baltics, Finland, Belarusia, and the Ukraine to the Germans, and to give the Caucasus to the Ottomans. Japan and Portugal got off pretty easily, the former only being forced to withdraw from all the colonies it captured during the war, and the latter only having to give up parts of Angola. Britain, however, would face the worst of the treaty. They would lose most of their colonies in Africa to the Germans, the French, and the Italians. One of the greatest losses for the British Empire would be the transfer of India to the Germans, creating the German Raj. To make matters worse, Britain is bombarded with reparation payments and are forced to scale down their military. Finally, to thank the Fenians for their support in the war, the Central Powers established an independent Ireland to be ruled by the Fenians. The Irish are finally able to return to their homeland. The Fenian government moves across the Atlantic, changing Canada's status to a puppet state of the new Irish Republic. With the British Empire having lost so much in the Great War, the British people are outraged. But there's nothing they can really do about it, for now at least. The 1920s are pretty eventful. Austria-Hungary inevitably falls apart, with the Germans and even the Italians moving in to annex much of their former territory. Germany helps reinstall the Qing dynasty all over China. Kerensky is struggling to secure his control over Russia. America slips back into splendid isolation, and the global economy is soaring. Until it isn't. In 1929, the Great Depression starts off in the United States, then quickly spreads across the globe. With the world in such a catastrophic state, it is the perfect time for radical ideologies to gain popularity. In Russia, Kerensky's moderate government falls out of favor with the people, and they would elect a more extreme candidate to be the Russian president, Boris Savinkov. In Japan, democracy is phased out and the country falls under the control of the military. In 1933, in the United Kingdom, the British people elect a new party into power, the British Union of Fascists. Their founder, Oswald Mosley, the man who had vowed to restore Britain to its former glory all those years ago, was now the Prime Minister. Mosley quickly gets to work on restoring the economy, rebuilding infrastructure, discreetly building up the military, securing absolute power for himself, and silencing political opposition.
You know, typical autocrat stuff.
Of course, Mosley has some other plans as well. Plans to wipe out the powers that had wronged Great Britain in the last war. But the main focus of his ire isn't on the Germans or the French, but the Irish. You see, in the years since the Great War, Mosley grew to resent the Irish, blaming them for Britain's defeat in the war. While the only contribution the Fenians made in the war was shipping supplies to the Central Powers with debatable impact, Mosley believes that there was an Irish conspiracy to sabotage Britain's war effort from within. His speeches to the British people are often loaded with anti-Irish rhetoric, also creating a myth that Anglos were the master race destined to conquer the whole world, citing Britain's impressive colonial past as evidence for this. Because of his anti-Irish views, Mosley's first step on his path to world conquest is Canada. When the Fenian Brotherhood first took over Canada back in the 1870s, they made sure to give fair and equal treatment to the French Canadians in Quebec. However, the same cannot be said about Canada's English population, who were basically demoted to second-class citizens. The Anglo-Canadians have been oppressed for generations, and tensions in Canada are at a boiling point. It is the perfect opportunity for Mosley to exploit. In 1935, the British secretly supply weapons to the Anglo-Canadian population through a network of spies. In 1936, the Anglo-Canadians rise up in an armed insurrection against the Fenians, starting the Canadian Civil War. Later that year, the Spanish Civil War also breaks out between the Republicans and the Nationalists. The British Empire, with the help of Portugal, immediately intervenes on the side of the Nationalists in full force. The Spanish Civil War is quickly won by the Nationalists in 1937. Spanish dictator Francisco Franco becomes another loyal ally to Britain, bringing all of Iberia under the British sphere of influence. With Russia and Japan still bitter about the Great War's outcome, Mosley sees yet another opportunity to make even more allies. In 1938, diplomats from Britain, Portugal, Spain, Russia, and Japan meet in Cape Town in British South Africa to forge a new alliance to challenge German hegemony, the Imperium Axis. By 1939, the German Empire has become very alarmed by British hostility and the creation of their new alliance. The German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop meets with French Foreign Minister Georges Bonnet to sign the Bonnet-Ribbentrop Pact. The purpose of the pact being to reaffirm Germany and France's relationship and form a bloc against further British aggression. France and Germany even agreed to partition the Benelux countries and their colonies. As a final precaution, known of Mosley's anti-Irish tendencies, Germany guarantees Irish independence. September 1st, 1940. In Ireland, the peace abruptly ends, the skies being blocked out by squadrons of planes of the Royal Air Force. British paratroopers are dropped onto the Irish coast and establish beachheads for reinforcements. Great Britain is invading Ireland. The Second Great War has begun. In response to the invasion, Germany immediately declares war on the United Kingdom. Britain's imperial allies quickly join in rapid succession: Portugal, Russia, and Spain. Japan takes this opportunity to finally invade China. Germany is joined by Italy, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottomans, reforming the Central Powers. France, however, does not declare war on Britain, publicly stating that they would remain neutral on the principle of pacifism and to attempt to negotiate a peaceful resolution to the conflict between the two sides, despite the Bonnet-Ribbentrop Pact, much to Germany's frustration. The Imperial German Navy attacks the Royal Navy in the North Sea, but Germany can only do so much to save Ireland from the British invasion. The Fenian government is forced to flee across the Atlantic to the Civil War-torn Canada. The Russians launch an all-out assault on Germany's eastern client states and the Ottoman Caucasus. The Russians are able to make gains in the east, but despite Russia's advantage in numbers, the White Army is poorly equipped and Russia's military leadership is very divided, allowing the German armed forces to eventually stop their advance. 1941. In Africa, however, the war is going much better for the Imperium Axis. Led by South Africa, the Imperium has captured German Southwest Africa, much of German East Africa, and parts of the German Congo. Their success can be attributed to Germany's limited capabilities to reinforce their overseas colonies, thanks to Germany having to concentrate on defending Europe. Reinforcements can't even be sent in from the German Raj as they're needed to assist the Chinese in fighting the Japanese invasion. April. France's political and military leadership meet to finalize their plans to finally enter the war. However, it's not the British they plan on fighting, it's the Germans. The official story of searching for a peaceful resolution to the conflict was but a ruse to buy time for the French to mobilize. You see, France never truly forgave the Germans for the Franco-Prussian War, and contempt for the Germans remained high among the French people. So much so that riots broke out across France after the government made the unpopular decision of siding with the Germans in the First Great War. But the days of bending the knee to German hegemony were over. The French would finally get their chance to take back Alsace-Lorraine, get revenge on the Germans, and once again become the hegemon of continental Europe. Their surprise invasion of Germany, codenamed Operation Charlemagne, is set to begin on June 22nd of that year. The opportunity to backstab the Germans was perfect. Germany is distracted by the Russians, the Central Powers are losing the war in Africa, Japan is conquering China, and Britain is in control of the seas. June 4th. German Kaiser Wilhelm II dies in Berlin. His son, Wilhelm III, is crowned as the new Kaiser of Germany. The death of the Kaiser is a morale blow to Germany, and secretly a morale boost to the French leadership, who now have full confidence in their invasion of Germany. June 22nd. The big day has arrived. Operation Charlemagne is set in motion. French infantry and armored divisions cross the German border, and their offensive is almost immediately halted by the Germans. Yeah.
Wait, you didn't actually think the German Empire would be as caught off guard as the Soviets were in our timeline, did you?
In reality, the Germans were suspicious of the French the moment they didn't join them at the start of the war. German intel had picked up on Operation Charlemagne months ago. Since then, the Germans have been secretly and strategically moving divisions to their western border. Kaiser Wilhelm II in his final days even took part in the planning. So France's revenge plot has completely backfired, and now their homeland is at the mercy of the Imperial German Army. After the German forces quickly turn back the French from their territory, they begin to accelerate towards Paris. The French government panics and calls upon the Imperium Axis to save them. Mosley, though unimpressed by France's debut performance, is happy that at least the Imperium Axis now have a front to attack the Germans from in Western Europe. Though by the time the British, Spanish, and Portuguese arrive at the Western Front, German armor has already advanced to the outskirts of Paris, and the Italians have even launched offensives into southern France and French Tunisia. After days of fighting, Paris would eventually fall to the Germans, signaling a turning point in the Second Great War. French North Africa surrenders to German and Italian forces shortly afterwards. Meanwhile in Asia, the Chinese front has stagnated and Japan's oil reserves are running low. Japan could get more oil from the German East Indies, However, the United States under President Huey Long has become openly hostile towards Japanese warmongering in the Far East, and America may retaliate to further Japanese expansion in the Pacific. So Japan elects to conduct a preemptive strike on the United States. On December 7, 1941, the Empire of Japan attacks the U.S. Pacific Naval Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. While American naval capabilities are hindered, Japan invades the American Philippines and the German East Indies. On December 8th, the U.S. issues a formal declaration of war on Japan. 3 days later, Mosley declares war on the United States. The American war machine revs up as the U.S. joins the Central Powers, ready to save the world. America enters the Canadian Civil War, quickly turning the tide in favor of the Fenians. December 22nd. Germany launches a grand counteroffensive against the Russian state. Now, invading Russia in the winter might seem like a dumb idea, but it's actually a 4,000 IQ move. You see, if they waited for summer to invade Russia, it would be winter by the time the Germans made it to all the important Russian cities, and they'd all freeze to death. But by invading in the dead of winter, it's the middle of summer when they arrive at Petrograd in Moscow. In May 1942, the Canadian Civil War finally comes to a close. After defeating the Japanese at Midway, the United States turns most of its attention towards defeating Britain's dominions. The U.S. blockades and eventually invades New Zealand. American forces make short work of their Bob Semple tanks and quickly capture all of the major cities, and New Zealand surrenders. November 1942. After the fall of French North Africa, the Germans in Africa were able to get resupplied from Europe and began pushing back against South Africa. American Marines assault Cape Town, the final nail in their coffin, causing South Africa to surrender to the United States. February 2nd, 1943. The Germans capture the crucial Russian city of Tsaritsyn on the Volga River. Seeing the writing on the wall, the Russian military overthrows Savinkov and agrees to an armistice with the Germans, much to Mosley's dismay. Meanwhile, in the South Pacific, the Germans and Americans begin to liberate the East Indies and the Philippines from Japanese control. After capturing the Coral Islands and months of shelling the Australian coastal cities, the US invades New South Wales, working together with the Germans who invade Western Australia. Canberra, most major cities, and much of the coast is captured within a year. Though the Australian government has surrendered, the Australian army has retreated to the outback and continues to resist the Central Powers from there, though the Central Powers don't see the Australian resistance as a real threat. January 1944. For the past couple of years, the Imperium Axis has not been doing well on the Western Front. Slowly but surely, the Germans have been pushing back the enemy further west, and Germany has now occupied most of the Iberian Peninsula, including Madrid. It doesn't help that ever since the war began, German engineers have been hard at work to produce incredible wonder weapons, and now that these wonder weapons are starting to see action on the front. In a desperate bid to turn the tide in Europe, Oswald Mosley orders a new offensive to retake Madrid and then liberate Iberia. Operation Stronghold. British and Portuguese armored divisions break through the front lines in order to encircle Madrid, and they nearly succeed. Thanks to a heroic last stand by the Germans at Guadalajara, reinforcements were given enough time to arrive and repel the Imperium Axis. Portugal would soon fall to the Germans shortly afterwards. By the spring, only Britain and Japan remain. There is nothing left to stand between the British home isles and the Germans. The British military approach Mosley, hoping to seek an armistice with the Central Powers, but Mosley has become quite delusional in recent years and believes the war can still be won somehow. June 6, 1944. After years of planning, U.S. troop transport planes take off from German-occupied France and covertly drop paratroopers all across southern Ireland. Meanwhile, hundreds of amphibious landing crafts carrying American and Irish-Canadian troops land all across the Irish southern coast. British troops put up a strong fight against the invasion, but are unable to push them back into the sea. The 7th Free Fenian Armored Division is the first to reach Dublin. Though, as the island was liberated from British occupation, the Central Powers uncovered a horrific truth. The British had been rounding up the Irish population into concentration camps where they were forced into slave labor and exterminated en masse. The discovery of this great atrocity only strengthens the resolve of the Central Powers to defeat Mosley's regime. With the success of the American invasion of Ireland, the German Empire begins planning for the operation to end the war in Europe, an invasion of Britain itself. Operation Sea Lion. President Long and Wilhelm III meet in Potsdam to discuss their plans for post-war Europe. Back in Asia, the Germans and Chinese liberate Beijing from the Japanese, and the Americans defeat the last Japanese holdouts in the Philippines. As its empire begins to collapse around itself, Japan resorts to more desperate tactics to ensure its survival. April 1945. Operation Sea Lion begins. After managing to wrestle control of the English Channel from the Royal Navy, the Germans land in Dover and push for London. While that is happening, the Americans are invading Wales and Cornwall. In the Battle of London, what's left of the British Army and civilian militia put up a stern resistance against the Germans. In his underground bunker, Oswald Mosley finally realizes the war is lost. On May 7, 1945, the British Empire surrenders. With the war in Europe over, the United States begins preparations for an invasion of the Japanese home islands. But as it turns out, America won't need to invade Japan. A few years back, German scientists had discovered a nuclear fission, discovering how to split the atom. The potential of such a discovery was immediately recognized by the German military. After years of work, with the help of many prominent scientists, mostly of Jewish descent, the Germans were able to create a new superweapon, the atomic bomb. In August 1945, German bombers take off from China and drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. In Australia, a third nuke is used to destroy Alice Springs. Japan surrenders, and so do the Australian rebels. The Second Great War is over. Now that peace had been restored to the world, borders had to be redrawn. In Europe, Germany annexes Flanders, Wallonia, and Calais from the French. Italy annexes Nice, Savoy, Corsica, the Balearic Islands, and all of French and Spanish North Africa. Germany then establishes puppet kingdoms in France, Brittany, Spain, and Portugal. Parts of Russia are annexed by the German Empire, but for the most part, Russia is left alone thanks to overthrowing Savinkov and are able to try to transition to democracy by themselves. Finally, on the island of Britain itself, Scotland is given independence after nearly 2.5 centuries of English rule. However, England and even London itself are split in two: the American-backed Republic of West England and the German puppet kingdom of East England. By the end of the war, Africa had been split in three: Italian North Africa, German Middle Africa, and an American-occupied South Africa and Liberia. The Sahara is largely abandoned. In Asia, the Qing Empire gets to annex Japanese Formosa and Korea, and even French Indochina. Japan itself is occupied by the United States. The United States establishes pro-American democracies in New Zealand and East Australia, while the German Empire turns Western Australia into a new colony, New Bavaria. As for Canada, the post-war situation is quite delicate. If the Fenians continue to rule over Canada, or even if they were replaced by a government impartial to race, there would still likely be violence between the Anglo-Canadian and Irish-Canadian communities. So Huey Long goes with the only logical solution and annexes Canada for the United States. With the war over, its aggressors vanquished, and the borders redrawn, it was believed that there would finally be lasting peace on Earth. However, international tensions and the potential for new conflicts began to resurface immediately. With Germany's ascension as a global hegemon and their development of the first atomic bomb, the United States grew suspicious of Germany's true intentions. So America quickly moved to militarize their allies and occupied territories and began the development of their own atomic weapons. In the final years of the war, President Long had consolidated his power over the USA, passing overreaching executive orders, strong-arming Congress into adding new amendments to the Constitution, and suppressing political and social opposition to keep himself in office indefinitely.
But don't worry, Huey Long is based, so that makes it okay.
The Italian Empire, which had become a superpower in its own right, subjugates the rump states of Serbia and Greece, much to the frustration of the Ottomans, who received no new land in the war, though the Turks soon discover large deposits of oil under Arabia, bringing upon the envy of the Italians. China, having finally emerged from its century of humiliation, and at the strongest it's ever been, breaks off relations with Germany, adopting an anti-Western attitude. China plans to undermine Western influence and take the Far East for itself. That is, of course, if they can deal with the far-left independence movement in Indochina first. And so we end with our world in the midst of a Cold War between Germany and the United States, a mini Cold War between Italy and the Ottomans, an extremely hostile China, and multiple potential flashpoints all across the globe that can start a war between any of the 5 major powers at any moment.
Thank you all for watching, and a special thanks to Simon for starting this fantastic project. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. This has been RJM3, Alternate Historian. Have a nice day.